Welcome to Seniors Count. I'm your host, Greg Jocelyn. On our show, we believe that you are the foundation on which Boston was built. So our goal is to connect you to resources, benefits, and information to enhance your life. Thank you for joining us today. On our program right now, we're having a panel discussion about a significant public health issue. How can we work to prevent suicide in an older population? Joining us for our discussion about this important topic is Linda Wallach from Samaritans and Lynn Kerner from Advocates Incorporated. Thank you both for joining us today.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
So I wanted to start, if you could just introduce yourselves, and so give us some context of where you are around this issue.
Okay, well, with Samaritans, I focus on elder education and outreach. We go to all types of residential communities for elders or senior centers, and we provide a free 1-hour workshop on good keeping your mental health healthy.
Mm-hmm.
How to recognize signs and symptoms of depression and possible suicide, and what to do about it. The average person does play a role. Everybody plays a role, and you don't have to be a mental health professional to assist somebody.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's great. Thank you.
I'm currently the director of 2 clinics in the Metro West area, and I also run multiple elder programs, and one of our biggest programs is Elder Community Care, and it's a combination of Advocates, which is the mental health program, and a crisis line called Call to Talk in Metro West, and also the local Aging Services Access Point, which most people know as the place where they get homemakers or Meals on Wheels or home health aides, things like that. And so we have combined our resources because we know that most elders are most comfortable going, to a place like their Aging Services Access Points and calling for information and other things. And so they help us kind of get people in the door.
Okay.
Many people don't want to come to a clinic, so we go out to the home. And then if we find someone who is very, very lonely, then we use our crisis line to actually make outbound calls and just have friendly conversation.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you both. And so today we're going to do things a little bit differently at Seniors Count. We're going to sort of see this as a panel discussion. It's a smaller conversation today, but there's a series of questions that we've decided upon beforehand that I'm going to ask. And so I was hoping that we could spend a couple minutes on each. And so whatever your immediate response to these questions. So, and you all created these questions, which I think is important. So the first question here is that we wanted to discuss is how common is suicide among older adults?
Well, the statistics across the United States for 2011, and that's the nearest year that they've put these numbers together, is 5,000 elders in that year have completed a suicide. And that works out to 15 elders every day. That number is tremendously underreported, simply because it's not recognized. It can be deemed an accident. It can be deemed a lot of things. Suicide is usually one of the last things that will be mentioned.
In terms of a report that we can measure
Yes.
and quantify. Right, okay. Okay. And so the question, how common suicide for older adults? Does that seem connected to your knowledge and understanding?
Yeah, I think one of the things is that we hear a lot from older adults, and I think it can get hard to sort out a little bit, is I wish I were dead, I hope that I don't wake up tomorrow, those kinds of things. And I think for a lot of us, we kind of think, well, the person, is older, they've lived their life, they might be chronically ill, they might have a lot of pain, and so in a way we might kind of normalize that and think, oh well, naturally they feel that way. And while that's true to some extent, we also know that we can minimize the sense of desperation or deep loneliness or depression that those real life circumstances can cause. So we know that talking about it, we know that just understanding, saying, well, I can understand how you feel that way,
Right.
but there may be some alternatives. There may be some ways that you can feel a little bit better. I think just kind of bringing that hope but not being unrealistic, because, we may know that the pain is real and, the person may have an illness that's very difficult to deal with.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, that brings us to our other question that we had posed is, why do older adults consider suicide?
So I would say, just kind of piggybacking on what I just said, I think for all those reasons, and isolation. So when someone loses their license because they can no longer drive, and in the community, in our society, maybe less so in the Boston area where there is more transportation, but as people get ill or their knees hurt or they break their hip and they can't get up on in the transportation the way they did, they can't get out to the places that they once got out to, or the places that were most meaningful. And so it can be hard to find one's identity and really feel like yourself when you can't do the things that you've always done, particularly if you were a community person. And you can't get out there, so socialization can become harder. And I think people start to look at it and say, what's the use? So I think those are some of the reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And adding on to what Lynn just said, I guess I kind of categorize it in three different ways. One is the lack of power, feeling powerless, feeling isolated and disconnected, and and alone, and feeling like a burden to the family. And you had mentioned earlier some of those statements. But and when you read in the paper about anyone's completed suicide, people, that's the first question. Oh, but why? They had so much going good in their lives. But it's, even though one thing may have triggered it, so to speak, or was the last straw, it's usually many things about the person's environment, personality, individual situation that kind of come together. And then the person just lacks the ability, or loses, not lacks, but loses the ability to cope. Because once depression sets in, it's like going down a dark tunnel. And the tunnel gets narrower and darker, and there's no light at the end of it.
And so the term feeling like a burden, can you unpack that a little bit more? What does that mean to feel like a burden?
Well, again, among elders, frequently, if they have they're recently diagnosed with a debilitating illness, they might start to think about they won't be able to do this, that they'll need other family members, that the family members are already have so many tasks at hand, and they don't want to be asking people for all these, the extra help and the extra support. They're afraid that won't be welcomed.
Right. Okay.
I think additionally, too, when they start thinking like that and start thinking about, well, it's that, or, am I going to have to go in a nursing home? And I think they don't see alternatives outside of that. So many people don't even know about resources. You were mentioning, at the beginning of the program, that it's about explaining resources sometimes. And people often don't know as much as we might think, oh, it's been around for so long, you know,
Sure,
and so everybody
sure.
must know, but in fact, a lot of people don't know where to turn, and so they don't know that there's help out there. And I know that, you know, my program has reached hundreds of people, almost 800 at this point in 6 years, and lots of people that we thought would know, you know, to call someplace and get Meals on Wheels don't know that, you know, and so malnutrition can set in. So there's other things that come from being isolated too. You can get sicker, it can be harder to go to your doctor and get treated, or I think some of it too is, where you were saying maybe losing some of that coping and feeling unempowered. Even people who are in a lot of pain might not know to kind of press their doctor about, well, you know, is there more relief for me? And I think that's another myth that kind of exists in the community and maybe in the medical community too, is that, well, you're old, you're going to have pain.
Yeah.
You know, I had a doctor tell me that when I was 50, and I thought that was a little extreme. So, but so I think it's out there. And so then people feel like, well, what, you know, there isn't going to be any hope, you know, any help for that. So I think that's what we try to do, you know, when we intervene, is to kind of open that door a little bit and put a little bit of light in that situation, because it's information and it's something
It's
that
true.
a person can do.
The
Advocating.
hopelessness plays in, yeah.
Tell me a little bit more. Hopelessness. How would you describe that?
It's a lack of seeing other options. And it's almost it truly is a lack of an ability to think of other options. That's what is definitely happening to the person with depression, which is why sometimes people say, oh, but they had so many other choices, but they couldn't see that. And it seems like such a simple thing, but it's not when you're in it.
Right. There's a quality of empathy that's required to really
Yes.
kind of. I mean, not everyone is going to experience depression and feel that, but that's a big reason why we're doing this here, is to think about conversations about suicide. It's a very taboo topic, and try to, you know, change how we talk about it, which does actually bring me to this question, which. About warning signs. So we had said, what are some of the warning signs of someone contemplating suicide, and signs of symptoms of depression, which we're talking about, that could lead to a completed suicide?
I wonder if I might just break two other myths
Sure.
leading up to this.
Sure.
Is that talking about suicide does not put the idea in someone's head.
That is important
After
to
survivor
mention.
of an attempt has said, if one person had talked to me. So that's certainly a key thing.
Right, right.
And suicide is not about wanting to die. It's about wanting to get away from the pain. And the psychological pain can be just as bad, if not worse, than the physical pain. And certainly among elders, if you put the two together, the psychological pain of isolation, feeling like a burden, the physical pain of having an illness or a loss of any kind, it's pretty overwhelming.
Of course, it is very overwhelming, but I like what you're saying here, because I never thought about it that way, that there is that stereotype that if we were to mention it, then it might, you know, extend the fear of suicide. You mentioned the word risk factors. Could you tell me a little bit more about what is a risk factor?
Sure. We were talking about that a little bit earlier. So for some people, we'll start with the genetic or the family component. So, you know, there are more people than we realize that have suicide in their families. And so we know that if any member of your family has committed suicide, then that raises the risk for everyone. And there are probably numbers of reasons for that, some of which may be neurochemical. You know, we all have neurochemicals in our brain, and, you know, there's some feel-good chemicals, you know, like serotonin and those kinds of things. And some people may have less of that, so it may be harder to get over something. So there may be those kinds of things. Certainly being male is a risk factor. More males than females commit suicide. I mean, die by suicide. More women attempt and survive, but more males actually complete suicide and die by suicide. Right?
Yes.
Just checking in on
it's good to have another colleague
statistics
nearby.
expert here, but so being male in and of itself, and then year by year, as they're putting together statistics, they do look at age groups, and they're not certain why. For instance, the age groups shift. So actually, elders used to have in the state of Massachusetts the highest rate. So even though it was the fewest number by rate, per how many people there are in those age categories, they had the highest. But now it's more middle age that's the highest, and we don't know if that's from the recession. We don't know why. So risk factors can vary. Protective factors, things that work against risk factors. Another risk factor is isolation. So some things that work against it is a strong belief system. A religious, so we'll have people say, well, I wish I could do that, but I don't have the courage. Or I wish I could, but I know that, God doesn't want me to do that. So there are things, thought processes and beliefs that people, hang on to that help them not attempt suicide. Or, I wouldn't want to do that to my family. So certainly having family is a protective factor. Actually, suicides are more common in whites than in blacks or Asians or Hispanic communities. Again, I'm not sure we know exactly why. It may be that there's more community in different ethnic groups. I'm not sure, but those are, so. Can you think of other risk factors that I've missed?
Yes, other risk factors would be any history of abuse, whether that was in the last year or 40 years ago.
Okay.
Any history of abuse, physical, verbal, sexual, any history of substance abuse, alcohol or drugs, a history of violence. And by violence, I'm not just referring to domestic violence, but soldiers, perfect example, who witness, anybody who is witnessing horrific violence when they expect it or least expect it is definitely more at risk. But these are none of these things, obviously guarantee somebody will proceed down that path. But it definitely is something to think about if you have a neighbor or a friend or a child, in the family. If they've had those incidences, even though if it was some time ago, it definitely puts them more at risk. Having said that, one of my personal experiences was somebody in the neighborhood. Idyllic family, raised 3 wonderful kids, all very successful. In their elder years, they had reasonable, enough money, and they got into gambling, just as for fun. For whatever reason, Mr. M got himself in over his head, and because of the shame factor, and then he continued to isolate and say, I'm going to get this out of this on my own, he ended up taking his own life, and during the funeral, his wife took her life. And it was, the 3 sons would have been more than happy to have helped out, and could have. So it can happen to anyone, is my point. There are the risk factors, but tremendous losses, and that person is feeling emotions of shame, again, powerlessness, burdensome.
And if you were to, what can you do if you suspect someone might be considering suicide? So perhaps in that situation, what could someone have done?
Well, Samaritans has a specific method called befriending that is one of the things that we teach at our workshops. Basically, we say if you have a friend, a neighborhood, a relative that you're concerned about, that you take some time to talk with them privately. And I don't mean you have to have an hour. You know, a lot of times short conversations are much better. But take some time to talk with them privately, give them your full attention, and ask them how they're doing. Say, I've noticed that you've been really going through a tough time, or this thing recently happened. How are you handling it? And then continue to ask questions. And then the last thing is to validate what they're telling you, their feelings as well as their thoughts, even if you think they're wrong at this point, or they're wrong-headed, you know, or they shouldn't feel like that. Zip your lip. At this point,
Listen.
say,
It's the advocate.
you know, you want to understand their perspective more.
That's listening, it seems key, conversation and listening
Yeah.
and care.
Yeah, it breaks down that sense of isolation, and you know, sometimes another person, even just saying it as you're talking about it, for a lot of people, that helps them kind of think through some other option. You know, it's kind of getting it out. It's kind of getting the mind working a little bit, and you know, we can all get to that point where we're trying to solve a problem, and we're like a little rat on a wheel. You know, we keep thinking of the same. Then we can only think of the same option over and over, and we think, well, that's not good. So, you know, I'll have to. You know, then you need somebody else's help at that point. So I just wanted to mention something that you were alluding to in terms of trauma and abuse, is that one of the things that we're seeing with older adults is trauma returning, especially if a person has not dealt with it. So many of our World War II vets, for instance, when they have a major loss, such as their wife dying, it brings up a trauma that they may have witnessed when they were in the war, and it wasn't as encouraged for them to talk about it back then. They were heroes, they came home and they went on with their life, and that was sort of the expectation. Now we know that that wasn't really the case, that human beings are affected, you know, all the time. So, and an interesting thing is that as people are starting to lose their memories to dementia, what are they remembering? They're remembering back in the day. They're remembering their earlier life. And so, in a sense, they can relive that trauma over and over again. So it can be really important, again, what you're saying about listening, you know, and understanding it's a way that they're trying to master that and overcome it. And the same for women who may have been abused in their marriage. You know, I've talked to several 70-year-old women who say to me, I've had it, I'm not going to deal with it anymore, I've been dealing with this for 50 years. And other people who never really dealt with, you know, early childhood trauma. And now we're, you know, dealing with it at age 70, finally kind of it coming to the forefront. So all kinds of things like that that are kind of complex, you know, but, you know, I think, again, being able to get it out and having one person say, are you okay? Are you really, you know, you having any thoughts about actually doing anything?
Are you okay?
Are you okay? Yeah, and you know, I want to be here to help you. I'm not sure, maybe you're not even sure how. You know, as the person who's talking to the person who's of concern, you might not even know exactly, but if you say, listen, we'll figure it out together.
I want to emphasize what Lynn was just saying, that it is a big myth that as you get older, it's easier to handle loss. It gets harder.
It gets harder.
And so elders do deserve more attention, more care. Everybody has their own process for grieving. But
that's very
it really is a big myth that it gets easier. And I would also like to add that in our befriending method, we even recommend that people put it right out there and say, you know, some people in your situation would be having suicidal thoughts. Is that happening to you? And then to normalize it.
To normalize it, right?
Don't say, oh, that's terrible. Don't say, oh, thank goodness you weren't thinking that.
Of course.
Because when people answer, most times they're not giving you the full truth and the whole truth, that first conversation. But by putting it out there, that gives them the opportunity at your next brief conversation to maybe they'll be more open about it.
There's so much to talk about around this topic, and it's very hard to choose a point for us to conclude the show. But we've actually run out of time, so I would love for you both to come back at any time to continue these conversations. And I want to thank you for your time and also for listening here. So thank you again.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to do it.
And thank you all for watching today's Seniors Count, brought to you by Mayor Martin J. Walsh and our Commissioner Emily Shea. We encourage you to contact us, 617-635-4366, and the Mayor's 24-hour hotline, 617-635-4500. We also have 2 suicide prevention hotlines available for you, which we've projected here on our TV show, so we thank our studio manager for doing that today. And so take care, and we will see you next time.
When I first connected with the Samaritans, it was right after Greg died. I was not okay. Yes, I needed help. Samaritans are so much more than just people on the other end of a phone. And you're not alone when you feel like you want to die, and you're not alone when you've lost somebody and you're grieving, and you feel like nobody will understand because there they are.